My name is Valentina. I am an assistant professor of strategic management at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the second panel of today of this great initiative that is about capabilities. And the main objective of this session is to delve into the role of capabilities in informing competition policy. And we will start with a presentation, followed by a discussion from distinguished panelists, each bringing unique insights to this dynamic topic. So let me briefly introduce all of them quickly. I'm pleased to have Lars. He's a partner in the Latham and Watkins Bruxelles office. He focuses his practice on complex cases in all areas of the European competition law, including abuse of dominance, restrictive practices, the European Digital Markets Acts, and merger control. Then we have Constance. Connie is professor in technology and strategy at the Tech Schools of Business at Dartmouth. She studies strategic change and has written extensively on the dynamic capabilities of firms and managers, technological innovation, and the dynamics of diversification and vertical integration. And then we have Raphaël. Raphaël leads the Bruxelles office of the Charles Rivers Associates, specializing in mergers and antitrust. He also possesses expertise in various competition matters, including merger analysis, abuses of dominance, cartels, and damages cases. And finally, we have Joanna. She's a case handler in the DG Competition Merger Case Support and Policy Unit. Previously, she worked in the merger unit for basic industries, manufacturers, and agriculture, and before joining the European Commission, she practiced European competition law as a lawyer at an international law firm in Brussels. So I just want to invite each of the panelists to open some of the aspects that has been touched during the presentation by David and Nicolas. Maybe because Joanna is touching some cases that has been just introduced by Nicolas, maybe you want to start? You can stay there or here as you prefer.
Thank you very much, Valentina, and thank you very much to David and Nicolas for that very interesting presentation and for the invitation. My husband is from Siena, so from the rival republic down the road, and I'm not allowed to come to Florence very much, actually. So myself and my daughter, who's there in the corner, are doubly grateful to have this opportunity. And final caveat, I should say, what I say here are my own views and not necessarily those of the European Commission. Listening to the presentation, to me it's clear a key question is whether, and I'm going to speak particularly about mergers because that's what I do day to day, is whether the framework we have of assessment of mergers, is it up to scratch in a dynamic context, and is it up to scratch to assess capabilities? It's true, I think capabilities is maybe not a term that features in our lexicon as competition authorities every day, but that's, I think, not to say that it's not an aspect that we are assessing. And while it is, I think, a legitimate question about whether there's scope for us to improve how we assess capabilities, I think the assessments that we are doing today do go beyond the nominal, even with our current framework as it is. We certainly know we cannot take a static view of markets. We have to be forward-looking, as has also been highlighted by the recent report of Mr. Draghi. And indeed, I think we try to use the flexibility of the framework we have to assess capabilities, and which are, of course, part of assessment of non-price competition, which is increasingly important in our assessments of mergers. But when it's important when we're talking about frameworks to recall we operate under a legal framework. The merger regulation and the guidelines, which is underpinned by the rule of law. Our assessments have to be balanced and objective based on the facts of evidence, and we have to produce motivated decisions, whichever way we decide. And we have a standard of proof that we have to meet. Just recently reminded in CK Telecoms and even the ThyssenKrupp ECJ judgments of, I think, just a few days ago, that we have to meet a balance of probability standards, so showing whether a transaction is more likely or not to impede competition to a significant extent. But importantly, this standard is the applicable standard for all mergers and irrespective of the complexity of the theory of harm, and that's been confirmed by the courts. So we do have the ability to pursue complex theories, but we have to be backed up by facts and evidence. So I take that we have the ability and we should be forward-looking, but we cannot be speculative. And now I will turn to, I think, what are a few examples in our case practice where we've shown we can assess capabilities in a dynamic context. And as David and Nicolas put in their paper, we have looked under the hood of target and acquire consistently across our case practice. One is in a potential competition context. Nicolas mentioned the acquisition by Adobe of Figma, which is a recent case example where we looked at potential competition. The merger was ultimately abandoned, so we do not have a final decision, unfortunately. So what I can convey here is our preliminary conclusions, which have been summarized in a merger brief. But it was an interesting case because it combined elements of a reverse killer acquisition as well as a more classical killer acquisition. We had the reverse killer element with Adobe potentially terminating its product development capabilities in interactive product tool design. And so there our focus, we were on the capabilities of Adobe and what the impact of the merger could be on those capabilities. And then we had the potential competition theory where we assessed the capabilities of Figma and whether Figma was likely to or was already a threat to Adobe in the vector and raster editing markets, which of course are markets where Adobe has had a very strong and potentially dominant position for decades. Of course, again, we operate under a legal framework. Here we applied the potential competition tests as set out in our current merger, horizontal merger guidelines, and assessed whether Figma was already a constraint to Adobe in the raster and vector editing markets, even though it had not entered, whether it was already a constraint on Adobe. And we also assessed whether Figma was likely to enter. And when we do these assessments of assessing whether a firm is likely to enter, we look at certain criteria. Again, we have to keep to an objective view. And to give you a flavor of the types of things we look at, for example, whether the potential competitor has sufficient relevant resources to enter, whether it has the ability to expand or add to its capabilities, either organically or through acquisition, whether the potential competitor has advantages that would make it well suited to enter, and whether the potential competitor has successfully expanded into other markets in the past or already participates in adjacent markets. And finally, what other industry participants think and whether they recognize a potential competitor as a potential entrant. I mean, these are non-exhaustive and it depends on the different market circumstances, but this gives a flavor of the type of characteristics we look at. Importantly, the finding of potential entry for us does not require finding of a concrete plan to enter, and that's particularly important in dynamic and fast-moving technology markets where there are no long lead times. So, and those were what we assessed in Adobe's acquisition of Figma. Of course, there are many technological mergers where we look at capabilities and we do not find any issues. For example, Google's acquisition of Photomath, a maths app to assist with maths homework that Google acquired. There you may, consider whether Photomath's capabilities would be problematic, but no, we found that Photomath's capabilities were not so unique, and in any case, Microsoft already had a comparable integrated maths tool in Bing, which means that Google was not going to obtain any special advantage through the acquisition. So another example where there was no issue. And so that's, technological mergers, as has been hinted by Nicolas. Another important area to perform a capabilities assessment is when you assess innovation, competition, and capabilities to engage in innovation and R&D, which is precisely what we did in our review of Dow DuPont. And an interesting question is, how do you actually measure capabilities in this regard? And in that case, the Commission looked at patent shares based on quality of patents, as well as shares of active ingredients. Of course, this was an agrochemicals merger, so your ability to discover and produce new ingredients was key. And the Commission used these parameters to determine that Dow and DuPont were very important innovators, and actually more important than what their market shares downstream would suggest. They also looked at the relevance of vertical integration of capabilities, so whether you can do all parts of the assessment in-house. So that was Dow DuPont. And then finally, I would add, for me, and perhaps most important for us, when we assess nascent markets, is to not look just at capabilities of target and acquire, but capabilities across the market. And particularly in nascent markets, we want to preserve the race to win and make sure every firm has ability and wants to become great, as David says. So preserving capabilities across the board is also key from our perspective, and that's what we try to achieve, for example, in cases like Microsoft, Activision, Blizzard, or NVIDIA ARM. And I think I will pause there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Raphaël, do you want to go next? Sure. Thanks for sharing.
Sure. Thank you for the excellent presentation and comments also. I will build up a bit on what also Joanna said. So what I think is very clear, of course, is that particularly in the context of merger, innovation is an extremely important parameter of competition that's important economically, and that we want to focus attention to. Looking at capabilities, of course, is one way to do so, and we can see from most of the comments just now from Joanna that the Commission is, doing it to some extent already in its practice as part of fact-finding when you look at potential competitors, you need to understand, looking at a merger, what the world would look like with the merger and without the merger. And obviously, when you do that, you have to try to understand whether the target, for example, could or would likely to be developing into a significant force in the market. Now, I'm sure there's a lot to be learned about how to do it right, and that's why it's important to have this discussion, but I think it's not foreign to the fact-finding exercise that the Commission does. Now, I think maybe a word of caution, at least personally, that I would see with respect to the different uses that we can make of this type of exercise. I think there are areas where it is quite natural to do so, and it is in particular when you think about competition and innovation that is somehow concrete, where you're thinking about a market where you have one firm being present, and you wonder, well, who is going to challenge that firm? At least when you think about that, you have a clear rationale for intervening and protecting this competition in a way that is quite tangible and understandable from a competition authority perspective. So we've talked now just, for example, about Adobe Figma. So I don't want to comment on the merit of the case, but just in terms of the approach there, in which you have a theory of harm based on entry by a merger of complements with potential entry on a core market by the complement. Those are standard economic theories of harm, at least when you see them like that. And the key question is really a factual question: is the entry by the target in this case in the core market really likely, and much more likely than entry by other firms that are not part of the transaction. So to do so, Joanna has explained that the Commission looks at a number of criteria. I think it's useful, but it's all very, in a way, it's not very well defined, and I understand we need flexibility to look at a variety of circumstances. But also, when we read, for example, those 5 criteria that you mentioned, we could think about, fitting many situations within those. And so, when we really think about, how confident are we about the conclusion that we are taking, it's still very open, and of course, we haven't had the benefit of a full decision that we could read in that case. But it's really a factual question that we need to try to reach a conclusion on, based on very solid evidence. And maybe one point that I was a bit surprised in that discussion is discarding the internal documents of the parties. So I'm really not saying that what you find in the parties' internal document is necessarily the truth, and we all know the limitations of those exercises. But at the same time, so looking at capabilities is important because it gives you, data on what those firms can do. But you would want to have some consistency. If you don't find anywhere that the firm says a certain plan of doing something, maybe they could, but is it really likely that they would, right? So I think that's the point where we may want to be cautious. And I note that in the discussion that Joanna brought, there was also attention being paid to what other players in the industry would view. And of course that can provide some information, but this is also very much subject to bias, because players in market investigation have their own agenda. And so, if you don't find anything in the parties' documents saying that there is a certain plan, maybe you have to be careful before agreeing or concluding that actually it doesn't matter because there is a competitor saying that this is likely that they would do so. I'm not saying that this is what happened in this case, of course, but I think a word of caution, of course, is important. So then that's I think that's the easier way to integrate a capabilities assessment in a very direct and tangible fashion within the current practice of the Commission. Maybe what is more challenging is this second aspect that you mentioned, Joanna, which is the R&D innovation. So how do we do it in that context? I think this is much more complicated because we are not talking about well-defined markets where we can actually have a good view of all the different competitors and their own capabilities and their likelihood of also developing important innovation. So I will stop there, but I think we've seen a little bit of that. We've seen the DuPont. There's also some mentions of that in pharma. When you think about, there hasn't been intervention, but because the more traditional approach in pharma is to look at overlaps with pipelines, or advanced pipelines, and sometimes even not advanced pipelines. But there is this last layer of intervention, which is to look at those innovation spaces there, which is to see whether they are close competitors. And yes, of course, capabilities may matter there, but before intervening in those spaces, one has to be extremely careful on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphaël, for sharing. Okay. All right. So I'm here as a capability scholar. My knowledge of antitrust, other than what I read in the last week, is about 20 years old. So having said that, I thought I would pick up on something that Joanna actually mentioned in passing, which is if you want to try and use capabilities to think about things like potential entry, innovation, you need some way to measure them, right? At least to get a handle on what they are, right? So, and I am going to, those of you are going to be stuck listening to the capabilities workshop in another couple days. You're going to hear a longer version of this, but there are, if you think about how to measure them, there are a couple of key features of capabilities that are sort of important to think about. One is what Nicholas mentioned, which is they are the ability to perform some kind of activity on a repeated and reliable basis. You do them in concert with assets or inputs like knowledge, equipment, and they're built through time, right? So learning is really key. The only way to buy a capability is to buy a company. I mean, literally. And they don't diffuse easily among firms and industry because they're organizationally embedded, right? So if you think about that, there are some proxy measures that one can use. And actually, I read the non-price competition brief, and the EU is using some of these, but I'll just go through a few. I mean, you can look at the amounts and types of experience, because learning is built through experience, performing activities that capabilities support. You can look at amount and types of inputs or assets, like people and knowledge, that you have to use, you need to use the capability. You can look at cumulative resources, both financial and non-financial, actually develop the capability. And you can look at like intermediate outputs, like patents or something like this. The issue with these things is that what I just said to you is very general, right? It doesn't actually tell you what to measure. The key thing about capabilities, they're highly context-specific, and they're highly firm-specific, and even within the firm, to particular units. And technologies. And so you really have to think really carefully about how to measure these capabilities. So if you just, an obvious way to measure capabilities, and I'm guilty of this, I've done that, is to just take spending, like on certain areas of R&D, right? But, I mean, you really have to think about, like, more carefully, what are these things used for and what's involved in using them? So I'm going to give you an example. Now, I thought for a minute, should I mention this example? Because it is from the oil and gas industry, which might not get me a lot of friends. However, I did this study many years ago, so cut me some slack. But the thing is that, you know, I was interested in understanding capabilities in upstream oil and gas, right? And say, well, how am I going to measure this, right? So it turns out if you put how much money you spend on oil and gas, it does actually predict, to some extent, how many reserves the companies find. But if you think about what's really driving a lot of new reserve, it's the capability to use really technologically advanced methods. And for that, you know this is a team effort. It's not, and the teams have knowledge that goes with the capability. So we were able to get really precise data, actually from publicly available data, putting it together with qualitative information about the nature of the technologies, how advanced they were, to find a proxy using the technological advancement of the capabilities and the technology which we knew really well, right? And lo and behold, this is not the point of the study, but lo and behold, the technological advancement in particular areas, like you had to understand horizontal drilling, multilateral drilling, you know, types of advanced oil recovery. I mean, seismic, you had to understand the technologies really well to do a study like this. And not surprisingly, it's quite predictive of how much oil and gas reserves the companies found. So, but my point is that this kind of contextual knowledge is, I can't emphasize enough how important this is to sort of using this if you want to take the capabilities approach carefully. And that brings me to a related point, which is it's not just how capable a firm is, but like sort of the nature of the capabilities. Like firms are different in their mindsets, in their approaches. Different firms, if you look across an industry, they have very different profiles of the technologies you're using and the capabilities that go with them. And, you know, and I think in one of the earlier discussions, I don't know if it's David or Nicholas, talked about the linkages. The physical assets are really very important because physical assets differ between these companies, right? Not every oil field is the same. In fact, they're radically different, right? So when you think about this and you're trying to understand the competitive effects, what always strikes me is, you know, in my area, we're interested in how firms can share capabilities to improve them, how they can recombine them, how they can redeploy them to the highest valued uses. I think in the competition literature, it falls under synergies, a very broad term. But I think that if we're going to understand what these benefits might be as opposed to the cost, it's really helpful to take this capabilities perspective. And, you know, perhaps this could help us get a sort of more fine-grained understanding of the benefits and the costs of the different mergers. So that's my plea for, like, in-depth contextual measurement.
Thank you very much, Connie. Lars?
Right, thanks very much. Well, that's actually a perfect segue to what I wanted to say, but I've been around for a while. I'm in my third cycle of competition policy development. As you can say, I'm graying a little bit around the temples and basically just shows that I've been around for a while. The first cycle was in the sort of late 90s, where we were going from what was then a very legalistic approach to then a more economics-based approach to where we are now, where we basically need a new approach because those two approaches don't really work anymore. And why don't they work anymore? Because they were anchored in a very different world, which was much more standardized. So what economics brought to policy back in the early 2000s was a sort of very structured, but still sort of a boxy way of thinking about things. And that worked because the economy across sectors wasn't all that different. People were making stuff with production equipment and they were pushing them to customers through standardized distribution systems. And if you ask yourself today, what is sort of a key driver of competitive advantage? Is it your production assets? No, they're in China. So it's really now much more heterogeneous and complex. In order to deal with that, you need what I would call a facts-based approach. You really need to understand how things work before you dive in. And therefore, I very much like the comment that Christopher, you had on how different ecosystems are, and that you have to approach them, in a sense, each of them on their own merits, because that's the only way you can understand, in a sense, how they work and how you should think about regulating them. And then the next, so when people talk about we need general filters, I don't think that will work in this world. But what I do think we need are, I come from Denmark, I love Lego. So what we need are basically building blocks that help us understand this complexity so we can simplify the analysis. And I think the capabilities framework is super interesting in that way, because it helps us create building blocks to understand where things are going and capture that dynamic element which we aren't currently capturing. And to be honest, going to this conference, I hadn't heard much about capabilities studies in economics, but I find it super interesting, and it made me think about a couple of Microsoft cases that I had been involved in, where I think the framework would actually have helped the analysis quite a bit. And it's not to talk about the specific cases. But the first one is Microsoft Teams, and the other one is Microsoft Nuance. One a 102 case, and the other one a merger case. And in the Teams case, I actually don't want to talk about Teams, but rather talk about Slack and Zoom, which are two players in that space. And if you look at sort of superficially what Zoom and Slack do, one is a video communication service. The other one is a message-based collaboration platform. So if you would apply sort of traditional analysis of, you would ask yourself the question, are they close competitors? You might be tempted to say no, because they do different things. Now, if you then factor in where demand is going, which I would now hypothesize is customers want integrated solutions because that helps them become more productive, and you look at where Zoom has been going in recent years, which is adding more and more capabilities to their service to start building a platform, and you ask yourself the question, who else could build that kind of platform? Well, Slack has it. They don't have the advanced video communication feature, but you could add that. Then all of a sudden, when you look ahead in terms of where demand is going and where the market may be going, all of a sudden, they may actually be quite close competitors. The other case, which is Microsoft Nuance, where I think the analysis would go in the other direction, which is also where the case ended, is Nuance is you probably don't know them, but they're a provider of software for doctors to basically help them automate the process of filling in medical health records. And they have a dictation system that basically captures what the doctor dictates and it then fills out the form. The next generation product is one where the software just listens to a conversation between the doctor and the patient and then automatically fills in the form. The doctor doesn't even need to dictate anymore. It's fantastic, right? And Microsoft, in a sense, doesn't have those capabilities. They are sort of a platform company. They're very good at creating horizontal technology, but they, of course, have very advanced AI, natural language recognition technology, which Nuance didn't have. So one player had all the expertise in a particular area to build this next generation tool. Microsoft had the advanced natural language recognition or understanding technology, and when you bring them together, maybe you could make this tool. Now, you could ask yourself a question just from a superficial level, say Microsoft, it's a fantastic technology company, go build it yourself. If you don't have the engineers, hire them. But the answer was, because Microsoft doesn't have these specialized sort of capabilities, and their people are actually geared to building horizontal platforms, people didn't want, talented engineers in this area wouldn't want to work for Microsoft. And so from that perspective, when you look at their capabilities on a forward-looking basis for what is the next generation product, you bring the two together, and it makes sense, and they probably weren't close competitors or potential competitors. So I'll end it there just with sort of the conclusion that, for me, the world is a facts-based approach based on building blocks, so ultimately the world belongs to Lego.
I want to ask a question from my experience before my experience as a practicing lawyer, where I became familiar with a very successful firm in a particular part of the economy that is not so successful anymore. I inferred from what I saw there, both that your last comment, you can't hire experts outside your competence, is clearly correct. But I inferred something else. Maybe it's a corollary of the Christensen phenomenon, which is a kind of inertial quality that organizations have. And the latter, it causes me to ask the following question, really of all the panelists, I don't mean this just the last speaker, which is, imagine you have a company, let's say Microsoft, and it really wants to get into an adjacent space, doesn't have the internal competence, probably can't grow it just by hiring people for the reason you suggest. How confident can one be that it can get it by buying a company in the adjacent space, or will its inertial and other incentive problems perhaps make it very hard for it to integrate that capability into the larger corporate ethos or whatever?
It's a very good question. I think in the case of Microsoft Nuance, the merger involved is that two corporate structures, and I think that, so you were hiring engineers that were used to working in a corporation. It wasn't a startup, so I think the cultures were probably not too different. So I think there the integration can work. I think where you have issues with integration is where you're hiring a startup, so you have 10 people in a garage that love the autonomy of being able to do what they want, and you force them into a corporate structure such as Microsoft. We'll just take that example. And often there it fails because you simply can't combine the cultures even if you even if you try to. So fit is important, and what companies sometimes do when they acquire startups is put them in a separate entity, incubator, to basically let them nurture their autonomy, and then you basically try to have sort of less aggressive integration, because otherwise it tends not to work very well. But I think it can work, but you have to be very conscious about the cultural differences of what you're bringing together. I think in the case of Nuance and Microsoft, Nuance have been around for a long time, so there I think it worked. But your question is a very good one.
Are you saying that the acquired firm can survive if it's kept somewhat separate, or are you simply saying you have to take a slow road to achieving synergies?
I think it's ultimately a balance. I think with experience, what you do is that you're much more gradual and intentional about the integration than what might have been the case in the past, and therefore you, in a sense, lose some short-term synergies if you can afford it. Sometimes you basically can't afford it, and then you need to find a way to integrate more quickly, and then you try to replicate within somehow the startup culture of giving this entity as much autonomy as you can while still plugging it into the rest of the organization. But it is a very real issue.
I was just going to add that some companies do this all the time. There's a capability for this. I mean, Apple has built so many of its functions by buying companies. That's why they design their own chips now. They bought a company. I mean, you go a little slowly at first. A few people leave, but a lot of people actually stay. They like the security of a large company, you know, et cetera. I mean, Microsoft does the same thing. So it's not necessarily the case that inertia kills these things.
I think it's reminding us that in the dynamic capabilities framework, the sensing, seizing, and transforming, these questions go to transforming. There are enormous literatures on this outside of economics in organizational behavior. There's communities of thousands of scholars that look at these things. I think part of our point is we have to distill some of that and bring it in here because these are very legitimate questions that you're putting out, and the agencies need to have some understanding of it. But it's not something that's studied in economics, but it's studied in organizational change, organizational transformation, organizational behavior. Connie teaches some of it, I don't, but we ought to know that there are other scholars that really are quite deeply steeped in this with empirical studies to support their results.
Me or you're calling me? Sure, I'll take it. So when I mentioned this concept of replicable efficiencies earlier today, I said I thought that's more important than passing on because if the efficiencies are replicable, then someone who has the capability can go in and emulate those efficiencies. Maybe that's more important than looking for efficiencies being passed on. So there's a notion of capabilities that I had in mind, but this whole notion of capability strikes me as pretty vague as a general matter. I could think of sort of three notions of capabilities. One is sort of an animal spirits notion of capabilities, Keynesian animal spirits. Do people have the right attitudes? You know, they're going to take advantage of opportunities. Second was technical capacities. Can they, this is something you pointed to. The third would be objective incentives. You know, can a firm make an economic profit, a profit above its opportunity cost by entering an area or emulating the efficiencies of some other firm? And those strike me as three different notions, and you know, it wasn't clear from your discussion sometimes, you know, which ones you're talking about, and it might be helpful to break up what you mean by capabilities.
We're, of course, trying to make it less vague. And, you know, and Connie's focused on metrics and measurement. You go back in time with market definition, for instance, there wasn't something out there called a Hirschman-Herfindahl index, and it was invented. That once we get our focus on the right issues, then, in fact, I think inquiry can advance and that vagueness can fall away. That's the reason for having this initiative. But if we just simply say it's vague, so therefore we're going to leave it alone, it doesn't work. And in fact, the thing that struck me when I started looking at mergers, if you actually go to the US guidelines, there's a heading which says you've got to look at incentives and capabilities. And I think European guidelines may actually use the word capabilities, but then you read underneath, there's zero in terms of telling you what capabilities are. So the world knows that capabilities matter. What we're lacking are the frameworks and the metrics, the theoretical structures to fill that gap. And that's what I think we're trying to do here and bring it into competition economics, because we cannot address this fundamental question of the wealth of nations, which is what's in the Draghi report and elsewhere. Politicians are asking the competition policy somehow rather connect with things that matter. And our answer is, well, competition surely matters. Yes, it does. But if we don't get it right, we can hurt competition as well, and we can hurt innovation.
I was just going to say, I can understand why you would say they seem vague. Really hard in 15 minutes. There's an enormous literature. It's all qualitative before you get to empirical measures, but there's a huge literature trying to parse out what's a capability. It's not in economics. But just, you know, if you would like some references, I'm really happy to steer you in that direction.
Finally, I've been trying for a while. I have a more specific question to Nicolas and David, because you talked a lot about mergers, and we discussed a lot this idea that efficiencies should be merger specific, but we limit ourselves to the dimension of specific to the firms at stake. But I wonder to what extent we can be equipped to analyze whether the efficiencies between the two firms can be secured through arrangements which fall short of mergers. Can this be a contract? Can it be an alliance? How could we assess what degree of integration is necessary to achieve the efficiencies that we envisage through the collaboration at stake?
Okay, so if I understand the question is, are there other forms of business arrangements that might be less, anti-competitive than mergers and provide the same amount of benefits from a capability combination standpoint? I mean, these are empirical questions, of course. Where I think, the way I go to this as an antitrust policy scholar is we've heard time and time again in recent policy conversation this idea that firms should build, not buy. And this is presented as a binary, so you have M&A or organic growth, right? I think this is absolutely flawed as an intellectual option, and we should resist this. These are very difficult empirical questions. There might be intermediary arrangements like alliances, joint ventures, and so on and so forth that might bring the same capability combination benefits, and we need to study that. But for that, as David was saying, we probably need a framework, and as Connie was pointing out, I mean, Connie was too modest to reference a paper from 2018 in which they conducted a very large survey of the entire literature on capabilities. There's hundreds of studies, including lots of empirical studies that provide some very good guidelines about what capabilities are, how you define them, how you can try to measure them, estimate them, ask yourself the good question. So I would say, rather than going out there in the policy discussion with these flawed, simplistic binary options, build, don't buy, I would suggest that we take the other route, which is a longer-term route, and we try to build and develop on the basis of the literature that exists.
I need to say that while this, as is pointed out, the field of capabilities has got long legs in management, it's not easy to port those findings across to competition policy. It's in part because there's heterogeneous quality in the literature out there, and secondly, the scholars working on these issues are not thinking about the specific questions that potential competition, monopoly power, and the normal things that competition policy experts are interested in. That doesn't mean that that literature is irrelevant. It just means there has to be some bridging taking place. And I think that's what we need to do, both to bridge and to make fit for purpose the capabilities framework so it's relatively easy for the agencies to apply. I found it interesting that on the one hand, Joanna, you said there's no lexicon for this, but then you actually went through, you do actually do capabilities analysis. So given that you're doing it, let's do it right. And let's do it in a fully embellished way.